Eric is the autobiography of my grandfather, Eric Langridge. His life began in Lambeth, London in 1925. In our last episode, we heard about Eric's time on the trains. As his grandson, I can say that impacted him about as much as anything else in his life. And forever afterwards, he had a love for trains. We also heard about his participation in the war effort, which was to be riding the trains and moving goods and supplies and men and resources for preparation for what we now know was going to be D-Day. The next big event in my life was to meet the GIs, and they got to meet the Limeys. It was a very amicable meeting, and there was a lot of interest shown in each other's lifestyle and work. Everybody showed respect for everybody else, and we all knew full well that we had to work as a team to get this show off the ground. Most of them were very concerned as to what was in store for them. They had to work hard and continuously. Their NCOs were very severe, and they had to be. Everything had to be absolutely perfect and very thorough. It was all a matter of calculated timing and accuracy. The invasion would be decisive. We did have lighter moments, however. Whenever there was a lull in the workload, we would all assemble in our rest room, and there I would be with Bill, the train, shunters, and other English and US men. We would either be eating our lunches or a card score would have started up. At mealtimes, we would often gather around a huge pot-bellied stove in the center of the room, which was kept very hot. We had never seen these before. Fired by paraffin or kerosene, and was maintained by GIs. Anyway, the engine crew would pull their ingredients, and the shunters, if they had any, would cook their own. But the GIs would add their supplies to the pool and accept anything that was cooked. There were two other men invited into our group who, although they had their own little shack, liked nothing better than to be involved with our group. One was Jack Hillier, who was a wagon examiner. His job was to examine wagon axle boxes and check all the wheels. To do this, he had a 2-pound hammer on a 2-foot, 6-inch shaft, which he would swing and tap the wheel. By doing so, if the wheel was sound, he would hear a sharp ring. If not, he would hear a dull thud, like a cracked china pot. As you can imagine, this was a very important and serious job. Assisting Jack was a middle-aged man who was not quite so intelligent as the others, but all he had to do was carry the oil can and bucket of grease and fill each axle box that Jack thought needed it. They were a good team, and George had great respect for his boss. George, unfortunately, was also very poor. His little wife was also not overly intelligent, but they were obviously ideal partners. They had 3 little girls in their family and lived in a 2-bedroom cottage that was grotty and unfit for human habitation, but it was all they could afford. George's poor state was noted by the fellow workers, but even more so by the GIs. Everybody suddenly seemed to have more than they could eat, and there was always something that George could finish up. If you can imagine what our meager rations were, it would be obvious what sacrifices the lads were making. It was the GIs who were the most generous. They always seemed to have ingredients, such as chops, hamburgers, or hot dogs that they couldn't finish. Sometimes it was obvious that it was cooked, but not eaten, so that George had a goodie bag to take home. There was also a quantity of Hershey bars, jelly beans, and gumballs lying about too. It was all done very subtly so as not to cause George any embarrassment. Although he was often teased and jokes were played on him, it was all done with good humour. Woe betide anyone who upset George. We all cared for him, especially the young GIs. So life went on. Traffic in and out of the course was getting heavier, and more equipment was arriving by the trainload. One day, Bill and I arrived on late shift, around 2 p.m., and there was quite a buzz of excitement among the crews. Apparently, a train had arrived consisting of 3 American switch engines for shunting. They were huge compared with our little engines, and very powerful. We had great ideas of running about on these, but alas, it had signaled the end of our close contact with the GIs. Each engine had its own crew, and we were not allowed on them. The course was now beginning to become more secure. They had provost, marshals, office, and MPs everywhere. Our duties began at the entrance, and now we were not allowed any nearer. Some of the equipment became top secret, and now the GIs would assemble the wagons into trains and bring them to the gate. We would pull them onto our yard and form trains for each destination. We were extremely busy for a while, but now and then were quiet times when nothing was moving. We didn't know it at the time, but it was due to the invasion date being unsettled. Our restroom now was at the side of the goods yard, situated near the engine turntable. It was an old railway coach, which had been stripped of its fittings with wooden benches placed along the sides. There was also a trestle table provided for mealtimes. The heating was provided by a little stove tucked away in the corner, fueled by coal from our engines. The windows of the coach were raised and lowered by a leather strap hanging down on the inside. Real Victorian coaches. In fact, a lot of them were placed at various seaside areas and fitted out as 3 or 4 berth holiday coaches for the railway staff from Minehead, Cove, Barnstable and Peyton. Card schools were regular now, and one had to be a good player to be included. One night, while the game was getting very intense, I wasn't playing, I decided to go outside to check my engine, which had been left in the siding, quietly simmering away. I put a bit more coal on, checked the water level, and then returned to the cabin. Only this time I thought I'd be clever and poke my head through the window and make them all jump. However, to my surprise, someone had shut the window. I have the scars on my forehead to this day. Of course, I became the laughingstock of the whole gang. You would have thought I'd learned my lesson from that, but at a later date, I decided I would do it again. Only this time, as I ran across the railway tracks, I fell into an examination pit and badly bruised my ribs. That was the last time I tried pulling that stunt. We also had normal goods trains arriving at the yard, and one day among the wagons were 3 of them that contained tons of potatoes. Every farmer was busy growing food for Britain, but eventually it led to a surplus, hence these wagons. Each wagon of potatoes had been sprayed with a blue dye so that they would be unfit for human consumption. But we all scrambled on the wagons and were successful in getting bags full of potatoes that had not been touched. We all made sure that George was also included in this harvest, which included turnips and Swedes. Obviously, we were breaking the law, but it was wartime, and we were under strict rations. Had we been caught, we would have been prosecuted and probably jailed. Our ration allowance at that time was bacon, ham or meat, 4 ounces per week. Butter and cheese, 2 ounces per week. Margarine, cooking fat, 2 ounces per week. Milk, 3 pints per week. Dried milk, 1 packet per 4 weeks. Sugar and jam, 1 pound per month. Tea, 2 ounces per week. Eggs, 1 per week. Dried eggs, 1 packet per 4 weeks. Sweets, 12 ounces per month. It's pretty easy to see what sacrifices were made when the lads shared their rations. It came the day when Bill and I were released from our duties with the Transportation Corps, and we will return to mainline duties. We were still top-line engine crew, so our trains were many and varied, including once relieving a train at Newbury which was bound for Plymouth. On the way through, we received many red alerts, especially when they were bombing Taunton, Exeter, and even Plymouth. We had no idea what we were carrying, but it was important enough for us to be placed into safe sidings for hours on end. Our normal journey of 7 or 8 hours took us at least 13 or 14. Then we had to struggle to get home, eventually arriving home after almost 22 hours of duty. This was not an isolated case either. Things were on the move and everyone was working flat out. Rules and regulations went out of the door, and whereas we should have had at least 8 hours of rest between shifts, we just kept going. I know there were times when we were standing in sidings that I was asleep standing up. We were shattered. How we ever managed to fire and drive the trains, I will never know. One of the biggest shocks we ever had was during a night shift. We had been on duty for quite some time when we were told to relieve a train from the north to Southampton. We walked down to the main line, bearing in mind it was pitch dark, and we came across a huge monster. There stood a huge American engine. It was enormous. It stood very high and the boiler was a long way up from the engine frame. We almost needed a ladder to climb on board. The footplate area was as big as our front room. It was nothing like we had ever seen before. These engines were sent to Britain under the lease lend agreement. The crew that had worked it from Banbury said it was a big pussycat and that we would find her very easy to work. So with great trepidation we pulled away from the station and uphill to Enbourne. The throttle lever was so high up that Bill had a hard time reaching it. His first pull made this cat roar into action. The power was awesome. There was a little rope cord hanging from the cab roof, which we took to be a whistle. So Bill pulled it to advise the guard we were on the move. It was amazing. There was a huge sound in that American horn, and we were quite shocked. This was going to be fun. Bill gave the throttle another notch and we began to move a bit faster. As he applied the power, he also changed gears. Only this time it was done by turning a handle. Ours had been a lever. Soon we were belching our way out of Newbury. I started to pour on the coal, and when I opened the firebox doors, it was like a huge cavern and the fire was white hot. We passed the Enborn signal box and then turned left onto the branch line to Winchester. The signalman was amazed to see this huge engine. We must have been the first of its kind to pass this way. Now we were beginning to pick up speed and the engine was pulling like a good one, but the best was yet to come. Because of her weight and height, we were beginning to bounce quite a bit due to the chalky substance under the rails. And when we went around curves, she literally started to roll, so much so that we thought we were going to tip over. When a bend and bridge came together, we really thought we were going to hit the walls. It was quite scary. We were rolling along at a good speed now, and as we flashed by each signal box, the man must have wondered what was coming and going with such a sound of strength and power. It was the same when we arrived at Southampton docks. We turned everybody's head, and Bill and I stood there proudly and quite nonchalantly acknowledging the waving hands. When we finally stopped, they were all over the engine like a swarm of ants. What a pity cameras were scarce. We unhitched the engine and made our way to the goods yard and the turntable. We then phoned the controller for instructions. There was nothing heading back, so we made our way home with a light engine. This was it. With just a light amount of firing, I was able to sit down and enjoy the journey. Priority was given to any other trains that were on the line, so that we were constantly held in sidings till the other train had passed. Once again, we were inundated with admirers of our engine. It amazed us how the word got out that we were about. The engine was purring along nicely with just a hint of power on the wheels, and we were doing the old rock and roll gently home. We got to Enborn box again, and the signalman flagged us down to say that we had to take the engine to Didcot. So we trundled down the line, and as we passed under the Black Boys Bridge, Bill pulled the cord, and we whistled our way through the station. We were like a couple of kids. Now the invasion was on, and sparks were beginning to fly. Equipment and troops had top priority, and every available engine was used for this purpose. We all had to work flat out. All days off were cancelled, and we were expected to work the trains through to their destinations without relief. But it had its rewards. On a troop train, we would stop at the nearest station to Southampton docks for the troops to disembark. Then we would be shunted back into the siding, ready for the next train to pull in. Once we stopped, Bill and I would secure the engine and board the coaches to search. It was a gold mine. There were cigarettes, lighters, gum, playing cards, drinks, K-rations, dollars and coins, even articles of clothing. Uniforms we did not touch. The guard would start from his end and do the same. This was considered train crew perks, so we looked forward to working troop trains forever, but it didn't last. There were less enjoyable moments, times which entailed a job that neither Bill or I relished. This was when accidents or suicides had occurred. Sonning Bridge at Reading was notorious for this. If we happened to be on the line at that time, we were directed into a siding, and having unhooked the engine, we would search the line. We took the guard with us, and he, being a hard case, would actually pinpoint the area. I could never look. We were also involved in another tragic case. We were working the last train from Paddington at 11:35 p.m. It was nicknamed the Boozer for obvious reasons. It consisted of 6 coaches fitted with corridors, but it was observed that the ladies of the night were using these corridors to work the trains to Newbury. The GIs would be the worst for drink and were easy targets for these ladies. So the railway bosses decided to take off the corridor stock and use coaches that had no corridor. This meant that the ladies couldn't go from coach to coach. It also meant that there were no toilets either. And one night a young GI, under the weather, hopped off the train at Aldermaston to be ill. As we started to pull away, he took a running dive at the open door. Unfortunately, he fell between 2 coaches with fatal results. A tragic waste of life. The war was intensifying now, and it became apparent that whatever was needed must have been sent to Europe. There were huge gaps all over the racecourse, and personnel were getting very thin on the ground. Life on the rails was quieter now, and Bill and I found ourselves doing more menial trips, such as stopping goods trains. One of them was from Reading to Devizes, stopping at every little wayside goods yard to offload full wagons and pick up the empties. This was a boring, laborious job that neither of us looked forward to. There was a moment of relief when we would be passing little cottages near the line, probably belonging to agricultural or water workers, and as we approached, I would carefully select the largest lumps of coal ready to push off the footplate. They would hit the ground and roll down the bank in several pieces. We would then give a little toot on the whistle and the cottagers would gather up the coal. I'm sure all the train crews did this, so these people never wanted for fuel. They would reciprocate when they could. Often when we arrived at the nearest station there would be a brace of pheasants or a pair of rabbits waiting. We used to hang them on the handrail outside the cab to keep them fresh and cool. My landlady was always very grateful for these and would make wonderful meals with them. Things were moving at quite a pace now, and rumour had it that the war in Europe was nearly over. In the meantime, changes were being made to our engines. They were being converted to oil-burning fireboxes. While it meant I could sit down now and just watch valves and dials all the time, it became boring. The hard work and challenge of keeping a full head of steam was gone. And then the next stage came into force in the shape of a huge diesel locomotive. It was now 1945. Bill and I were working a train from Oxford to Winchester when we were informed of the announcement of peace. It meant that when we passed every cottage or station, we would blow both engine whistles to let the world know. Every train was doing the same. Church bells were ringing, flags were flying, and there was sheer joy on everyone's face. As we left the branch line into Newbury Main Line, detonators had been placed every 10 or 20 yards. These were about the size of a mince pie, and as the trains would run over them, they would explode. It was all a cacophony of sound. I stayed with the railways until about 1950. The Newbury Control was being phased out, and train crews were being posted elsewhere. I was now married, with a wife to support. We had our own flat. Olive did not want to leave her family, and so a decision had to be made. I decided to leave the railways. I should back up a little. I first met Olive when she was 15 years old and was working at her first job in a bakery. It was situated across the road from our railway shed, and I used to nip across to buy buns, etc. After chatting on occasion, we eventually started going out together, and I was able to meet her dad. He was a devout Salvationist, as were all in his family. Olive's granddad was a founding member of the Newbury Corps. Her dad was a brilliant musician, and he could play any brass instrument and often did. He was known throughout Newbury as a brilliant cornetist. He loved the army and had brought up his 3 girls to do so also. Unfortunately, Olive lost her eldest sister early in her life, and then shortly afterward lost her mum. In those days, tuberculosis was a killer disease, and it took away a lot of people. Anyway, having suffered this trauma, her dad became very protective of his remaining 2 daughters, and I was carefully vetted before I was allowed to take Olive out. He was a lovely gentleman, and I was able to respect his wishes, probably helped by my own upbringing. Olive had led a very narrow, sheltered life, so as I was a man of the world, I made it my hobby to take her and her sister Mary out on our rail trips. It was also during the time of food shortages, and whenever possible, I would get them extra pieces of food through the railway black market. I enjoyed looking after them all, including her dad, so it was natural that we would eventually get married. Times were hard in 1948, but Olive was determined to wear white for our wedding, but material was very scarce in those days. She was lucky enough to find a second-hand dress, which she bought for £3, and so we were married at St. Nicholas Church in Newbury on January 24th, 1948, Olive Piper to me, Eric Langridge. Our wedding cake was supplied by the baker where Olive worked, which was quite a treat in those post-war days when ingredients were still in very short supply. Now, this is Martin speaking. I've been speaking all the way through, obviously, but these are not my grandfather's words now. These are my words, and I wanted to share a little bit of an extra piece of information. My grandfather's book focused mainly on his life up to when he got married, and it's very much focused on his vocation, on his life of work, and understandably, such a big deal to him. And his meeting my nan, he goes through very briefly. Now, he loved his family. He was such a big family man. but I think his book, he kind of focused on his work life and those experiences. Um, so I wanted to share one little story that I think it may have been my nan that shared it, and it's kind of sad but funny, and there's kind of a note of triumph to it as well for my nan anyway. But um, my my granddad, I think at one point um, had a couple of young ladies that he was getting to know before he settled on the one he would marry. He was a good man, and so hopefully this is not a poor reflection on him. But and it certainly wasn't in the way that my nan told the story. But anyway, um, she was meant to meet up with him, and they were going to go to the cinema and watch a film. But at the last moment, he cancelled, and she was upset, and so she and a friend decided they would go to watch the movie together, and so they went um, to the cinema, her and her friend, my nan Olive, and they were really annoyed because all through the movie there was this couple in front of them that were kind of holding hands and kind of, you know, leaning in together and kissing and whatnot. And when the lights came on at the end of the film, it turned out it was my granddad with a different young lady. Now, obviously, at the time, this was a pretty devastating moment, and I guess it is a poor reflection on my granddad. You know, certainly not a good thing to do. But my nan kind of told the story in such a way that, you know, she eventually was the one who won my grandfather, and he was the one that she married, and it all turned out well in the end. But that was always kind of a funny story that we heard as grandkids growing up, and I guess that, you know, this all took place over 70 years ago now, and both my granddad and my nana are with the Lord, so I guess it doesn't matter too much. But just a humorous incident I thought I would share from the perspective of a grandson.